Now, Adrian is a product management leader that has crafted products used by tens of millions at 2 unicorn companies. He has extensive expertise in direct-to-customer, high-growth digital companies operating in mobility and delivery marketplaces, insurance, locations, and KYC. So a round of applause for Adrian as he comes to the stage. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. And let's get this thing going. We're going to be talking for the next 30 minutes or so about how to move from product manager to product leader. And after the previous presentation, you already learned what it takes to become a product manager. Obviously, you got this under control. And now we're going to talk about what are kind of like the areas of improvement that it would be good, from my opinion at least, to look at in order to upskill yourself as a product manager and move towards a more managerial position. First, a few words about myself. I'm a Chief Product Officer at Getsafe, one of the leading insurtechs in Europe, a German company operating in the digital insurance space. Previously, I was VP of Product at Bolt, and obviously we're going to have a few examples from like the mobility and ride-hailing space. I'm originally from Romania, always glad to be coming back to Budapest. I've been here several times within the tech ecosystem. I'm also a supporter of the tech ecosystem in Romania. I'm a co-founder at Cowork Timișoara and quite involved in the startup ecosystem in Romania. Obviously, you can connect with me on all those social networks because it's the right and trendy thing to do. And let's kick this presentation. So as product leaders, there's a reason why we have those like product-led companies. And there's a reason why product is so precisely centered at the core of all businesses, so they can actually create and manage that chaos, that complexity, so that it drags the business, it pushes the business into the right direction. And you've been probably seeing this graph in many occasions, but I just wanted to highlight that like you are in the middle of a lot of things, and this is just like a small representation of technology, user experience, and business. And normally towards the beginning of your career, you're probably more focused on the user experience and technology part. A lot of the product managers have these areas as core strengths and background, but in time you will also upskill the part of the business, right? And we're probably going to be focusing more on things related to the business and business understanding, because from my experience and from what I've noticed, this is one area that needs serious upskilling for a lot of product managers that are aiming to go towards leadership. And if you do this right, you get to wear this t-shirt, obviously, around the company. Just to make sure that there's no more debates, you're the master of all knowledge. Your word represents the ultimate truth. And of course, you'd wish that would be so simple, but it's not, right? In order to upskill yourself from product manager to product leader, you need to develop a lot of skills. And you're going to need to develop hard skills and soft skills. And we're going to start with the hard skills because aren't they hard? They are indeed, because there's a lot of learning that needs to happen, and they don't just come overnight. It usually derives from experience, from failing often, from trying to learn from smarter people and from managers that you might have in other companies, and try to upscale your understanding and your knowledge. Okay. And when I talk about the hard skills involved in skilling up as a product manager, I'm not going to talk about things that already make you a great product manager, right? Like I'm already assuming that like you are already a very strong in tech, senior product manager, like you have a lot of data savviness, you know how to look for the right data points, you know how to choose certain KPIs within your domain, you are already customer centric, you are output oriented, and you understand what it takes to have like a good ROI, for example, in the way that you choose projects and you allocate the time of your engineering and designers and so on, and you're great at execution, right? So these are all things that they are expected to be developed for any skilled product manager. But we're going to be focusing a bit on kind of like a higher level of skills that would qualify you as a great product leader to drive the organization forward. And the first one that I want to talk about is unit economics. And unit economics are some sort of like a very fundamental way in which a business is measured. And think of social media. If you are to kind of like assess the value of companies operating in the space and try to see where the value is, you might be tempted to say, well, they sell ads, right? Like we all know that they make ridiculous amounts of money. They are some of the highest revenue organization in the world when it comes to revenue. And sure, that is correct. There is an output that you can look at. But if you look and try to compare different social media companies, let's say, you will see that they become more granular. They look into active users, whether that's daily or monthly. They look into engagement. They have all sorts of in-depth KPIs that ultimately measure one important thing: time of attention from users. Now, if you start to think about like the value of it being the time, the eyeballs of attention, you start to understand, for example, why Facebook acquired WhatsApp, right? When WhatsApp had no revenue. So it doesn't really fit the previous explanation, how much money are you making, but it shows you there's tremendous value in the human attention, in capturing the attention of humans for an X amount of hours per day. And that is one very fundamental way in which you can look at, from a unit economics perspective, at a lot of domains. And if you agree to that, then you get to the understanding that platforms that facilitate this, like the Apple and Google platform, Android, they are actually the platform for all those small apps that actually try to capture hours of attention per day. So then you start to understand that those platforms as an aggregate actually are the gatekeepers for human attention for many hours a day. And you start to understand why there's so much power and so much value there, right? We all probably heard about lawsuits from gaming companies that are suing Apple and they are kicked out of the App Store. Even though they captured the attention within Fortnite, they captured the attention of users and engagement for an X amount of time per day, which was very valuable. They could sell a lot of in-app purchases, but they were just not really agreeing to paying the platform owner a share, so they got kicked out of the platform. I'm not going to discuss about like whether that's good or bad, but I will look at it objectively and say there's value in the platform, and it's important to understand that. And if you understand that, like look at things like Spotify or Netflix, right? Like their goal was to capture hours of attention. Sure, like we can get into what that means from a business, like what they did in order to capture the attention. But if you know that, then you will probably have a better understanding of why a lot of the podcasts are about 3 hours long. A lot of the really good ones just happen to be like 2 to 3 hours long, because that's the amount of hours that it's reasonably to expect to be captured from a human attention in a certain period of time. So that type of like deep and fundamental understanding of the value is what allows you to really understand your domain better and measure it in ways that make more sense from like a leadership perspective. Okay, so let's assume that you do this digging deep into the unit economics, and you need to start to understand the business, and you need to start to understand the business versus your competitors. And again, let's take an example, and let's look at value in ride-hailing. And you can take companies like Bolt or Uber, and you look at the apps, and I'll ask you, like, where's the value? Like, how would you distinguish between the two of them? And you might say, okay, so you open the app and you see the price, and one has like more expensive, one is lower price. You can see, how far away is the closest driver, like in how many minutes you would get a ride. You can see how well nicely the app is done. Things like how easily payments are going. But that's, again, a very superficial understanding of the business. The value in the ride-hailing business comes directly from the essence of the business itself. They are supply and demand marketplaces. From like an economical standpoint, the value derives from the fact that they are marketplaces. And as a marketplace operator, what can you sell? Like, what is the value that you can sell? Well, in this case, is the hours of online drivers. And how many hours on online drivers can you have? Well, that means that you need to have a lot of drivers. But the drivers will not stay on your platform unless you have high occupancy rate. So that's the second thing that gives you value. Like how much of the online hours of the drivers can you sell? And then, of course, there's the third component, which is how much commission are you taking. But if you think about it, literally everything in the ride-hailing space, every choice that you see in the app is a direct consequence of understanding these few things that are actually generating value in a ride-hailing space. And of course, you can play around with that, but you will soon reach a very dark mathematical conclusion that in most cities, leaving a few huge cities aside, in most cities it is mathematically impossible to have more than 2 players within the ride-hailing space. Why? Because if you're having smaller market share, that means you have small demand, that means you will sell very few hours. So even if you have a lot of drivers, you can only sell a very small percentage of that. So your occupancy rate as the third or fourth player, by definition, mathematically, it will be too small to generate high occupancy. So either you pay a ridiculous amount of money to drivers just to stay online and be empty, or you're going to lose the drivers immediately. That means you're not going to have drivers around you. That means the pickup ETA will go from like 2-3 minutes to 15, and that's the end of your business. And if you understand that this is how these companies actually fight for market share, then you understand why they are hugely capital intensive, and all of them, they are still struggling with profitability, because they will only be profitable in a very clear mathematical unit economics based way if there's 2 of them. Or, of course, there can be an ideal scenario with 3 of them having 33.3%, but, let's be pragmatic. The reality is not like that. Someone will be more ridiculously well-funded, and they will just buy market share. Okay, easy peasy so far, right? But then, if you understand, if you start to look into the unit economics, and then you start to understand the nature of the business and how to see your competitors and how to measure value there, then one of the concepts that I start speaking more and more about is finding pockets of value. And what are these pockets of value? Now, think of the business that you're trying to create is like a puzzle. And you can recombine that puzzle. You can use those puzzles in multiple ways and still get an end nice result. And the reason that you should do that, you should try to recombine the unit economics in new and diverse way, is because markets are never static. Like whatever you see as a snapshot, the next day is going to be totally different, right? Companies will enact on their marketing plans and their growth plans, and they will acquire new users. So everything will continuously shift on the market. So then will be new opportunities or new threats, right? Imagine you are operating an e-commerce website and Amazon just announces that it will enter your country. This is an extreme example, but I'm very sure that your strategy would have to change pretty soon, because things change on the marketplace, and you need to go back to the drawing board and take the unit economics and reinvent them in some way. Now, if you look at that from this perspective of pockets of value, there's beyond what players on the market do, there's also external market forces. And the reality is usually these are much stronger. And actually most of the discussion should focus on external market forces. And what do I mean by that? It can be things like innovation and technology, right? Like we have all these tiny devices that are exceptional cameras, and think of what digital photography did to companies like Kodak or Polaroid, right? It's not like they couldn't do digital, they could, but their businesses were just obliterated. Why? Well, because apparently many billion-dollar companies were founded precisely around the concept of picture and sharing pictures, right? Like for humankind, the value of pictures, the value of those memories was still there. In the market, the value was there. It's just that they moved from paper to a completely different way of interacting and having those. So that was a consequence of market forces that were, it's very hard for you as a company to control, or it's almost impossible unless you're like the government and you take weird decisions. But as a company, you can't really play with market forces to that extent. So they will just affect you, right? Like we've all came out of this 2 point whatever years of pandemic, and we've seen the market just going left and right and valuations going up and down just because of external market forces. And if you understand how unit economics shift because of a change in the marketplace, then you start to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. In the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, there was a lot of unemployment in a lot of rich countries, North America and Western Europe. What was the consequence of that? Well, there was a wave of sharing economy startups, right? Like Airbnb, Uber, TaskRabbit, and so on. Like that's when food delivery was invented, even though it was invented before, but it was like, from a unit economics perspective, it didn't have enough people interested to do that job. Of course, technology, 4G, there's a bunch of other market forces, and I'm like simplifying this a bit, but the point is to understand what it takes to kind of make that puzzle. And just, can you guess what those numbers are? Let's talk about like a very interesting space that popped out lately, and news that happened around tools that designers use. And we've seen how Figma was just acquired by Adobe, and there's Canva and a bunch of other tools for designers. And the reality in market forces was that a couple of years ago, that was the ratio of designers to engineers in companies. And you can look at Atlassian or IBM and look how it changed. Now, if you understand that type of market force is changing your domain, then you start to understand. Of course, Figma and Canva and other, of course, they are beautiful, gorgeous products to be used by, but just the fact that they are gorgeous doesn't mean that they would have a market for it. But if you understand the trend in the market forces that will allow you to recombine unit economics, then you start seeing those pockets of value that become apparent. So you either do this consciously, and ideally you kind of like discover it as a product leader, or you're terribly lucky. They are both great. But just understand that there's deeper reasons to how unit economics play out in the real world. Okay, so now that you have all these things hopefully close to figure out in your domain, then you can start look for product to market fit. And this is always like an elusive concept, and everyone says, do we have product to market fit or we don't? And usually if you ask yourself, you probably don't. And one way I talk about product to market fit is normally you push your product to the market. You do sales, you do marketing, you just like shout as loud as you can about your product. But the moment you start to have product to market fit, that's the moment when the market starts to pull your product towards them. You're going to see that sales go easier, people are excited, they start talking about you. So if you are in product or marketing, you will understand and you will actually see it, because things will happen with your CAC to LTV ratio, like cost of acquisition versus customer lifetime value. And this is, CAC to LTV ratio is like a very simple, very straightforward way to analyze a lot of technology companies, right? Like if you have a CAC to LTV ratio that is very decent, and you recuperate your cost of acquiring your customer in, say, 1 or 2 years, and you still have very high growth, say 60% plus, I think every investor will be knocking on your door and will say, hey, tell me more about what you do. But, because there's a but. In the real world, things are complicated. Remember how I told you that you can take a puzzle and recombine it and do it in different ways? I'm going to give you different metaphors because I like metaphors. Think of you as a chef, and you're cooking and you have a bunch of recipes, and you need to cook something better than your competitors. Your ingredients are pretty much the same. How do you cook something that is better or which is functioning? And let's take video content. How can you make 30 billion revenue per year from video content? Well, turns out there's 2 companies that did this last year, right? One of them is Netflix, the other one is YouTube. They both do video content, right? They both made a ridiculous amount of money. They are both very good companies and businesses. And yet, their approach to the exact same thing, like they cooked with the same ingredients, they cooked a slightly different recipe, and you have Netflix with 200 million paying subscribers, they produce a lot of their content, they license the other part, and they usually operate within small margins. Very similar to unit economics in traditional movie industry. But if you look at YouTube, 2 billion plus users create the content. Some of them have a lot of viewership, so they get the revenue share, and in general, they have very high margins. Both extremely good businesses, right? Different recipes, and it's not, the end result is not like a delicious food, but it's profitability and market share, but very similar ingredients in the cooking process. So always think that you can You don't necessarily need to copy the incumbents. You don't necessarily, even if the incumbent is, a new startup that just like spiked to profitability in the last 1 or 2 years, you can still cook the recipe differently, because if you understand the unit economics, there's value in recombining them because of market forces. All right, but that usually requires a lot of complexity, right? Like thinking the strategy, it's not like a feature. You can't do it in a sprint or in a quarter. That usually involves thinking on like a longer term. And then one of the key things that you need to do as a product manager is to think about this incremental building. As a product manager and as a product leader, this is probably the most complicated part in product management. You have this great generous idea, but there's a lot of work to do it. And you just build things instead of delivering, and that's obviously the wrong way to go about it. But what you need to do is you need to break it down into pieces that you can parallelize and build and release, and they will deliver value at every single incremental step of you launching something. And that is an incredibly complex thing that can happen. And I'm not talking here necessarily about startups where there's like 10, 20 people and they all talk to each other on a daily basis. I'm talking, 200, 500, 1,000 people, and coordinating that complexity in order to get great products out there requires a few things, but I'm going to talk about 2 of them. 1, it requires a great team, and 2, it requires you as a product leader to align with the rest of the company, to align with your stakeholders. And we've just had a presentation about looking for product managers and how you can be hired as a product manager. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of things that are really important, right? I'm not going to talk about how to set up a company culture and how to continuously upskill the people in your team or how to do a good compensation. They are all fundamentally important. But there's a lot of things that have been written about this. One thing that I want to highlight here, which I think it's important because it's not accentuated enough, is when to not hire people. And I've seen in too many cases product leaders, and not just in product, that say yes to lukewarm candidates just because they need to fill a position fast, just because they need someone in the team. And I'm encouraging everyone to think twice about this, because you should probably say no to that hire. Why? Because if you put someone who is so-and-so in a domain, you're not fixing anything. You're missing out on 50% of the opportunities in that domain, and that's compounding over time. And the other more qualified people in your team will notice, and they will think this is the new standard. And you're going to realize probably 1 year later that you made the wrong decision because you were in a hurry, and now you need to transition someone out. And that's time-consuming, and that's unpleasant, and it ruins the morale in the team, and it's usually quite expensive for companies. And I'm not saying this, from a product leader perspective or a company perspective where people are bad and just leave. No, in many cases, people are amazing. It's just that you selected the wrong one. You compromised, right? If you think of product managers that are, have great domain expertise in a business-to-business traditional company, and you're a startup in direct-to-consumer, and you want to hire with someone with great expertise, and someone that comes from a traditional B2B company, they will have a lot of processes. They will have a lot of structure. They are great professionals. They put products out there that are generating hundreds of millions or billions. And you're a startup that is always changing, always in the experimenting. And if you get a candidate who has all the skills on paper, but is, for example, not comfortable with being in an always changing environment, they are not comfortable with uncertainty, and you close your eyes to that, you're actually doing a great disservice to that candidate. So be very, very careful to really hire the right people. And it can be also the other way around, right? You can be an extremely talented, data-driven product manager who's a lot into experimentation and innovation. And Boeing or Airbus will probably not be the company for you, right? You're not going to do experiments live in production there. I'm exaggerating a bit, but there's companies that fit your profile as a product manager. So both as a candidate, but also more importantly as a hiring manager, do keep that in and explain to the candidate that they are great at the product management skills. You just don't believe they will be set up for success in the type of organization that you are currently having. And then the other one is stakeholder management, right? And Again, stakeholder management, a lot of like nice buzzwords, like you need to do stakeholder management and you manage the stakeholder. Like what do? You go for a coffee and then you try to make friends and you remember their kid's name and their dog name and you become like very friendly with them, which is great, right? Like you should totally do this, not just for the purpose of managing stakeholders. You should do this with people in your company. You should get to know them. That is an objectively very good thing to do. But the best way to do stakeholder management is to really understand what they do. You remember that they are humans, they have their careers, they have problems in their teams as well, they also want to grow their team, they also want to have more exposure in the company. So, and they also have KPIs, they have something that they need to solve within their domain. And it's very important to understand that because the complexity that is required for you as a product leader is to actually build this complex online to offline, or as I call it, like from bits to atoms, right? Like you need to merge bits and atoms into one continuous experience, even if you're like, purely digital companies, say like Amazon Cloud Services, right? Like the cloud is not a cloud somewhere floating. Like it is an actual building that has actual humans that installed things in there. And if you're like, if you operate an Amazon delivery center, there's a lot of atoms to be managed. There's probably more atoms than bits in a lot of those companies. And if you look at ride-hailing or food delivery, oh my God, the complexity in the real world with like food getting cold and the map not being accurate and the restaurant not accepting the order or not cooking the right thing and so on. So that means that you need to, understand logistics, you need to understand operations, you need to understand what your country teams are actually doing and what are their KPIs. You absolutely need to understand what your colleagues in customer support are talking about with the customers, and hopefully you're doing that. But beyond that, there's value in customer support, there's cost, there's tools. Like if you're going to have customer support that costs you like 3% of the whole company revenue, you can just reduce that by half with automation. You're never going to have a feature exclusively from a product that is so impactful in the business. You need to understand how legal works. You need to understand finance. You need to understand marketing. Like the more you complete your understanding, then you can truly build complex features that actually bring added value to a lot of domains at the same time, right? So the stakeholder alignment is actually baking in co-owning KPIs and helping the rest of the departments actually do what they are meant to do as well. And this is kind of like the type of complexity that I'm talking when I say like this bits to atoms, because we live in this like online to offline, most of the companies are this like online to offline companies. Okay, so these things will not happen overnight. Obviously, I'm highlighting those that I've seen on the area of hard skills that are truly important because you really need to focus on them. It's a lot of learning and a lot of practice and a lot of reading that needs to happen in order to upskill you in this area. And you might say, sure, like we got all of this under control, right? Like we're good to go. We're the best product leaders ever seen in this whole world. Well, the reality is you also need the soft skills. And they are actually, they're not different. They are actually an application. Like how do you put this into everyone's minds and souls? How do you create the energy within the company and towards your consumers to kind of embrace the value proposition and get to that product to market fit that we were talking about? And the sad reality is that when we talk about product leaders and leaders in general, the negative feedback often focuses on style or how things are being delivered rather than on skills and expertise. And there's a very interesting source, Edelman Trust Barometer, very fascinating. They do some of this analysis every couple of years. I think this is one from 2016 when they went into business quite a lot, but they do talk about social and economic items. And this is something very interesting. Like if you look at integrity and engagement, they have the biggest gap. Like when you see like the importance perceived by the people is the dark blue, and the actual performance of the leaders is the light blue. So the biggest gap between how important people think that it should be as a skill and the actual performance, the biggest gap is in integrity and engagement. Like we're pretty good on operations on products, right? Hard skill-wise, like we're doing better. And if you look at the actual, like the objective numbers, like the 33 and 28 for operations and products are actually quite good numbers. They are higher than integrity and engagement. But also the expectations from the larger audience is that you're much better as a product manager on your soft skills. Now, I'm not saying this is good or bad. These are just facts. This is how humans work. We're complicated electrochemical animals, and this is how we perceive the world. And we need to accept that fact that this is how people see things. So the fact that you learn all those things kind of looks like it's table stake, like you need to have them, because otherwise you will not be able to deliver meaningful products and you're not going to have like hard revenue. But the how you deliver it is actually very important. And we're just going to briefly go over some of the conundrums or questions that you might have when you're trying to balance your style as a product manager and as a product leader. And you always need to be collaborative and decisive. You need to involve stakeholders, you need to get everyone on board, but there will be moments when people will not agree. And when what I was saying, when you need to make those decisions and understand the stakeholders, you can make very good trade-offs. If you understand the KPIs of all the domains, you can actually explain the bigger picture, saying we're going to go down for a couple of months in those 2 or 3 KPIs in like customer support or marketing or operations, but essentially the business from an ROI perspective will do better, and these will align over time. And you are decisive, you are upsetting short-term a few people, but because you did the work on the hard skills, you actually have the arguments to balance this properly. And you also need to be strategic and tactical, right? Like we talked about this. Like you have the long-term strategy, but tactically splitting it into smaller incremental pieces is absolutely fundamental. And like depending on the situation that you are in, you need to choose and balance between being more strategic or being more tactical. Then enthusiastic or critical. Of course, as a product manager, you need to be inspiring. You need to be inspiring the team. You need to be inspiring to the leadership of the company. You need to be inspiring to the customers. But you can't just say it's awesome, it's awesome, it's awesome to everything that comes out of the mouth of all of your colleagues. At some point, you need to also be critical. And one of the things that I always think is you need to be mildly disagreeable as a leader. And I'm saying mildly because you don't need to be an asshole. It's absolutely a big no-no. But mildly disagreeable, think from your perspective. Like if you have an idea and you start talking about it from like the get-go, the moment you hear your words out, you're thinking, man, that sounded better in my head. And the reason for that is like you didn't put enough work into it. And you start writing about it, and all of a sudden it's like looks much better. And you leave it for 2 days, and you go back to it, and you work again, and it's so much better. Now, if you put that type of pressure on the people in your team, under pressure, it turns out that these humans, electrochemical animals that we were talking about, they do better. But again, mildly disagreeable. Like a small amount of pressure is great, but at the same time, don't forget the enthusiasm because you need the team to be motivated, aligned, and energetic. User-focused and business savvy, right? Like if you think of, if I'm going to tell you that I have this new product that I invested a ridiculous amount of money in, and it's called teleportation, right? It solves quite a lot of problems. But if the cost is what, like 300 billion for one trip, then I'm going to have 0 customers, right? Like that's not, like everyone would be excited because consumers would be delighted, but I would not sell anything. That's not a business, right? Like if you have a great product, there's a lot of temptation. Let's give it for free. Let's give as much as we can for free so we have users. Sure. But that's not, that's what users think they want, but that's not what they want. They want a great product. A great product is built by great employees. They need to be paid. They want great customer support. They want great warranty. That is money. You need to make sure that from a business perspective, you are keeping this in balance, like the customer needs and wants, to also the money and the budget needed to make the business work and actually deliver that product of quality. And then data-driven and intuitive. If you work in this space, you will know that this cookieless revolution that is happening, attribution is much harder to get, and we're moving a bit back in like 10 years ago when product managers were supposed to be a bit more intuitive. But in my opinion, that never really went away. You just had access to more data and more structured, and I'm convinced that this will continue to be. What I call this area is like you should have data insights, which is the combination of data, domain expertise, and common sense. And you need to balance this in order to make the right decision. If you just do like blind data-driven, you will just do small incremental improvements. And as we said, that's not always what the customer really wants. So from my perspective, this is a lot of items that I talked about. The list was obviously far from being comprehensive. These have been just a few of the areas that I noticed that there's quite a severe lack of skills in some areas in some companies. So do take your time to develop these qualities. Understand if you are more of a tactical or a strategical person, if you're more decisive or collaborative, and try to balance yourself as a product manager and as a leader. And going back to the hiring part, also, please, as candidates, as individuals, as humans, don't make the compromise as well. Do think if a company culture fits you. Do think if the mission and the way that people work there fit you as a personality. And if they don't join that company or move away from that company and go somewhere where you feel respected and where you feel that you can bring the highest added value. If you do that, you will be more successful professionally and happier in your personal life. And I think this is what we all ultimately want, to have this mix of great successful professional life, but also to be very balanced in our personal life. This was my presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We have a few minutes left for questions. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Adrian. Another round of applause for Adrian. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you haven't done so yet, you can go into Slido and you can actually start typing in your questions. We do have one. Do you have any recommendations how to get better at being mildly disagreeable?
So always praise in public and do your criticism in a one-on-one. So one of the ways that you can put this pressure on is to take your colleague separately and give feedback, but give constructive feedback, and also explain why the current version is not good enough for whatever, a document they prepared or an opinion or an insight or a data analysis. And if you want to do this in public, make sure that you're not targeting anyone in particular. Make sure that you're commenting on general items. And you can, test, because you are working with humans, so you need to understand the personalities, and hopefully you've done this in the frequent one-on-ones that you do. So ideally you understand who are the people that you can push a bit more because they need the pushing, they need a bit more permission to take a bit more risks. But also some people might be, a bit more introvert, and you as a manager, you need to cook your recipe of how to put this pressure differently on people, because your goal as a product manager is to have the highest output of your team, right? You're not there to make all those individuals be like a completely functioning machine and they are all equal and they all perform the same. This will never happen. We try this in political system, it doesn't work, right? So you need to make sure that you as a manager, you understand the individualities and particularities of each of your team members, and then make sure that you put that pressure in the different way. And do put it in one-on-ones, not in public, because then if you do it in public, you're going to get most likely quite the opposite effect.
And I actually I know a book like Radical Candor. It's also kind of around this space, yes, which is actually another good kind of source to get into that space and how to give that kind of feedback. And the
latest book on Netflix, which is also talking about the culture of giving very direct and honest feedback. So it's also the organization needs to be in tune. If you're the only one giving direct feedback without a proper culture, it's probably going to feel odd. But as a product leader, hopefully you can influence the culture.
Well said. All right, next to the next question. That just flipped. I'll do that one then. How do you implement an unpopular decision if your team usually resists change?
Well, one of the ways that I enjoy doing it is having your ROI on point, right? If you do your research and you have a nice spreadsheet with potential impact calculation, and the decision is controversial, because as a product manager, you need to say no, and as a product leader, you also need to say no. And there's a lot of companies that are chasing that easy revenue sometimes, which everyone knows that is not going to be scalable, but they are chasing it a bit for too long. So someone needs to take an unpopular decision to cut that revenue and focus on where there's actual growth. So the way to do this is usually to be ridiculously well prepared. Do your homework homeworks, make sure that you truly deeply understand what you're doing and why, and make sure that you have solid data to back it up, because that's a very, very strong way to show that you've done your homework. And if you have reasonable calculation and estimations, because there will be estimations, the moment you're going to get feedback on that, and you're not going to get any more negative feedback, then it's very hard for people to protest against rationality. If it's super rational and it makes sense within the respective context, it's very hard for people to say no. And usually what people do is just maybe they disagree, but they still commit because your plan sounds solid, logic, and they don't have a better one.
And previously we were talking about conviction, and I think that also goes into like if you have that reasoning and that data plus the conviction,
yes,
you can get through that much easier.
Yes.
All right. Next question from Daniel. For someone who is ready to take the next step towards being a product leader, what is the first skill you would recommend they work on?
So it's not necessarily a skill, but it's a bit like zoom out on what I said. Get better at business, right? Like really start to read economics. Like try to understand how the business works. What happens as a product manager, you get handed a domain and you get handed a KPI or an OKR and just you're being told do more of that. I mean, like I'm simplifying, it's like an insanely complex thing to do. There's a lot of learning and iterations that need to happen there. But you're rarely gonna have as a product manager to reformulate the value proposition of the company, right? Or to rechange the brand positioning. You can do that as a product leader, but not as a product manager. And you can influence it as a product manager the more you grow. But the way to do this is to build up your business and economic skills, because ultimately, if you have features that bring money and you have the right ideas where you can bring more revenue, then you're definitely going to get the attention of everyone in the company, hopefully. If you don't, then change the company.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now to the next question. How do you settle a debate as a PM between different engineering teams? There's
two things that are very important to know, that and it's quite common to have two people that don't agree, whether they're in engineering, product manager, data, and so on. First of all, you need to figure out if they are competent, like if they have the right level of knowledge and skills. And many occasions, and hopefully in a lot of the companies, people are skilled and knowledgeable. So you will probably have two people with quite decent expertise. And then the second one is make sure they have good intentions. And really, most of the problems come from the good intentions part, because there's a lot of unspoken things like, yeah, I want this, but why do you actually want it? Well, so I can hire 3 more people in my team so I can get a promotion. Well, that might be good for you, but there you go, you kind of uncovered where the problem is. So make sure that the people are both knowledgeable and they have good intentions. And if you find that there's something missing in knowledge or something missing in good intentions, that is the point that you need to fix. And it's probably hard for the two that are involved in that discussion to just point it out, but you as a third party, even if you're not the manager of any of them, but as a third party, you can spot out those missing gaps.
Thank you for that. And then I'll take one last question. Tips on practicing and acquiring hard skills, unit of economics, pocket of value. Any tips here?
Read an insane amount, and do read not directly from your domain, because the human brain is very interesting at creating those parallels. So if you do this lateral thinking, I was giving example from social media to video content production to the movie industry to mobility marketplaces. If you begin to understand how these things work, what essentially needs to happen is you can go from very abstract to very practical. You can immediately distill concepts from you talk about a feature, and you immediately distill it to the quintessence. Now, this is a muscle. You need to train it. And if you read a lot of smart people that are doing this type of analysis in books, on articles, on blog posts, on several domains, then you will develop kind of the parallel thinking and say, hey, okay, this kind of applies to what I'm working. And you change here and there something in your perception, and all of a sudden you have a new assumption that you can go and test, usually called innovation.
Thank you so much. So the questions that are up here are actually very relevant for our next panel conversation. So whoever wrote them, please bring them back, as we're going to use more questions in this panel.